صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. ثانية على حب الحسن والحسين. اللهم صل على محمد. For the love of Rasulullah, a third salawat in the loudest of your voices. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. ولعنة الله على أعدائهم ومنكر فضائلهم من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Respected scholars, elders, my dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Quran, in many verses, He speaks to us about the pivotal role that the Prophet plays in our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In Surah Al-Ahzab, Surah 33 of the Quran, Ayah 21, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala highlights what we benefit from following the Prophet. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. That indeed, in the Messenger of Allah is an excellent pattern for you to follow. He's an excellent role model for you. But he's a role model for who? Is he a role model for someone who just wants to live a hedonistic life? No. He's not a role model for those people. Is he a role model for someone who just wants to accumulate as much money as possible and indulge in their lower desires? No, he's not. He's not who you should look to if that's your goal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that Rasulullah is the best person to follow if you have the following goal. لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو اللَّهِ. If you hope to reach God, if you want to have a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then He's the best person to follow. Meaning that if you have the loftiest objective, if you have a high objective, which is that you hope to reach God, then He's the person that you follow. لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو اللَّهَ وَالْيَوْمَ الْآخِرِ. If you want a relationship with God, if you want the joy of living a life in close proximity to Allah, then He's the person that you follow. If you want success in the hereafter, if you want to live a life of eternal bliss, not just temporary pleasure, then he is the best person to follow. لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو اللَّهَ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ وَذَكَرَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا. Even if you're someone who already has a relationship with God, even if you're someone who's already pious, you can still greatly benefit from this man. So the Prophet is not just a guide for those who are lost. He's not just a guide for those who are far from God, who hope to have a relationship with Allah. He's also a guide for those who already have a relationship with God. So he can bring you to God, and he can also enhance your already existing relationship with God. Now, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa alihi. One of the things that we learned from him is not just about how to strengthen our relationship with Allah, but he also teaches us how to nurture our relationships with the people around us. And this is a very important aspect of our faith. You see, Islam was never meant to be a private matter between you and your Creator. Islam was never meant to be a private religion where religion is just about my relationship with God. And therefore, we leave it to the private domain. The Prophet, in his life, he demonstrates that the way we reach God is actually through the relationships that we have with the people around us. So some traditions may look at people and the relationships of this world as a distraction from Allah. Whereas Rasulullah says, no, you can actually attain nearness through your relationship with your parents. You can attain nearness to Allah through your relationship with your spouse. You can attain nearness to Allah through your relationship with your children. You can reach God through your relationship with your neighbor, with other mu'mineen, with Ahlul Kitab, and even with kuffar and munafiqeen. So every human relationship is actually an opportunity for us to reach God. This is why the Quran tells us, أَيْنَمَا تَوَلَّوْا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Wherever you turn, you can find the face of God. Meaning, you can experience Allah no matter where you turn. You turn towards your parents, your neighbor, no matter where you are, no matter what your circumstances are, you can have a rich interaction with Allah because the face is symbolic. If I want to communicate, if I want to engage with someone, I turn to their face. Allah is saying, wherever you go, whatever situation you're in, you can encounter my face. You can have a meaningful relationship with me. So what I'd like to do over the course of the next 2 weeks that we have with each other, we want to look at the guidance that the Prophet gives us, that is Ahlul Bayt give us with respect to our relationships. You know, some of us, we're very good when it comes to our salah. We know how to pray, but we don't know how to treat our parents. I know how to pray. I know how to fast. I know what to do when I go for Hajj, but I don't know how to treat my children. I know the ahkam of fasting, but I don't know how to treat my siblings. What we want to learn is how to navigate these relationships. Because the Prophet was not just a recipient of revelation and someone who was just passing on God's message to us. Rasulullah, as a husband, he represents God's message to husbands. As a father, he represents how we should be as fathers. He teaches us how to deal with Ahlul Kitab, how to navigate our relationships with even munafiqeen. So the goal is not just to focus on our vertical relationship, which is our relationship with God, but we want to strengthen our relationship with Allah by learning how to treat the people in our lives with dignity. And through those relationships, we hope to strengthen our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the path to Allah, it goes through people. We cannot live in isolation. The Prophet never taught his companions that if you want to attain nearness to God, you have to go into solitude. You have to isolate yourself. Spirituality is about learning how to deal with people, learning how to interact with people in a way that enriches them and enriches you. Now the Prophet sallallahu in his famous month of Ramadan sermon, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, every year we review the contents of this sermon. But there's one thing that the Prophet says in that khutbah that I think, at least, we don't really ponder enough over. there is a pivotal line that he mentions in that khutbah that we have to really reflect on and make it one of our primary objectives to fulfill in the month of Ramadan. What does he say? He says, أيها الناس من حسن منكم في هذا الشهر خلقه كان له جواز على الصراط يوم تزل فيه الأقدام. The Prophet says, O people, whoever improves his akhlaq in this month. You see, you might already have some good traits of character. You might already be a patient person. You might already be kind. But there's always room to be more patient. There's always room to be more kind. The Prophet says, whoever improves his akhlaq in this month. Improving your akhlaq could mean that you enhance and you improve the already existing virtues. You become more patient, more grateful. Or it means to eradicate and uproot those negative characteristics that we have. If I'm an angry person, let me make an effort to be less angry. If I'm impulsive, let me become less impulsive. If I'm selfish, let me be less selfish. The Prophet says, if you do that, you will receive something very valuable. And that is, you will receive a jawaz to cross the sirat. You know, in Arabic, the word jawaz, especially the way that we use it today, it means like a passport. If I want to go to a certain country, I need a visa. The visa allows me to enter certain countries. If I don't have a visa, I will be denied entry. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, on the day of judgment, if you want a visa to cross the sirat and enter Jannah, the Prophet says you need a visa. And that visa is what? You have to have good akhlaq. You have to have good akhlaq. It's not enough to just tick a box. I prayed. I recited dua al-iftitah. I did tasbih. I did ziyarah. Allah will say that's all good. But let me talk to your parents. How did you treat them? Let me talk to your wife. Let me talk to your siblings, your aunts and uncles, your relatives, your neighbors, your colleagues, your employees. How did you deal with them? Maybe you prayed, maybe you did all of these things, but you will not be permitted to cross over into the gardens of bliss because you did not put enough effort in becoming a more noble human being. This is very important. You see, brothers and sisters, if we don't develop our akhlaq, what's inevitably going to happen is that we're going to trample over the rights of other people. If we don't develop noble character, what's going to happen is I'm going to violate the huquq, the rights of those who are around me. And the greatest of sins is to violate and to infringe on the rights of others. You know, we all, every single person in this room, we all revere and we are in awe of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi alayhi. You know, when someone is very dear to you, you want to get to know them more. You want to deepen your relationship with them. You know, sometimes you sit with people who you love and you converse and you talk. And sometimes when you're sitting with people who you're very comfortable around, you start talking about life, your hopes and your fears. And sometimes you ask people who are close to you, what is your greatest fear in life? You know, if I were to ask you, what is the thing that you are most afraid of in life? For some people, I'm afraid of losing a loved one. I'm afraid of contracting a terminal illness. I'm afraid of losing my job. I'm afraid of a number of things. Every person, we have certain fears. Have you ever thought, what would Ali ibn Abi Talib say if you asked Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, oh Ali, what is your greatest fear? If you were to ask Amir al-Mu'mineen, what are you most afraid of? Amir al-Mu'mineen in Nahj al-Balagha, he actually tells us that there's one thing that Ali is afraid of. What does he say? He says, وَاللَّهِ لَأَنْ أَبِيتَ عَلَى حَسَكِ السَّعْدَانِ مُسَعَّدًا أو أجر في الأغلال مصفدا أحب إلي من أن ألقى الله ورسوله يوم القيامة ظالما لبعض العباد. Imam, he says that I would rather sleep on a bed of spikes all night. Some of us, we can't even sleep on an uncomfortable mattress. Amir al-Mu'mineen, he says, I would rather sleep on a bed of spikes all night. And I would rather be bound up in chains and dragged as a captive. Those two things are preferable to me than meeting Allah and His Prophet on the Day of Judgment as someone who did dhulm against some of His servants. If you ask Amir al-Mu'mineen, what is your greatest fear? His greatest fear is that I never want to be someone who is a zalim. When we think of zalimeen, we straight away think of dictators. We think of Fir'aun and Saddam and Namrud, and we think about Netanyahu and all of these criminals. But the reality is, they were able to cause all of that destruction because they just had more resources than you and I. But maybe if I take a moment, I might realize that the qualities that are in them are also in me. But I wasn't able to cause as much destruction because I didn't have a military. I didn't have endless money. I didn't have people who listened to me. But those vices might exist in us. So, developing our akhlaq is very important. So we don't meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the Day of Judgment as oppressors, as people who did not uphold the rights of others. Now, when we speak about huquq, what types of rights do people have? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, for instance, that people have, number one, the right to live. They have the right to knowledge. They have the right to health. They have the right to benefit from their personal property and public property. They have the right to be treated with honor. They have the right to be treated with respect and dignity. And what you find is, my dear brothers and sisters, that Allah tells us that we do not have the right to violate the rights of others. Because those rights that people have, Allah gave them those rights. So to infringe on the rights of my brother, my sister, my parents, my children, in reality, I'm trampling upon God's right. Because those rights come from Him. There's a beautiful narration that we have from Amir al-Mu'mineen, salawatullahi alayhi, where he says, جعل الله سبحانه حقوق عباده مقدمة لحقوقه. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Imam, he says, Allah has placed the rights of His servants ahead of His own rights. Now you may say, how is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given more importance, He's given more urgency in upholding the rights of others than His own rights? I'll give you one simple example. of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts the rights of his servants over his own rights. If a Muslim passes away, let's say that they don't have anyone to inherit from them. They pass away and they leave behind some wealth. And let's say that this Muslim, this deceased Muslim, did not pray for 20 years. They have 20 years of qada prayers to make up. And this individual also has debt that he owes people. Let's say that he owes X amount of dollars to certain people. And there's only enough money to either pay back the debtors or to hire someone to do his qada prayers. Salah is haqqullah. Salah is God's right over us. The money that this person owes represents the rights of people over him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what does he expect in this situation? Does he expect that this person's wealth be used to hire someone to make up 20 years of qada, or does the money have to be given to the people? The money has to be given. The debt has to be paid. This is an example of what? How Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he puts the rights of people ahead of his own rights. We have to understand this, my dear brothers and sisters. Some of us, when it comes to haqqullah, we're perfect. We have everything in order. But we belittle the importance of haqqun nas. Another example that we have is Imam al-Hussein, salawatullahi alayhi. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, where is he buried? He's buried in Karbala. We know that if you want to be buried somewhere, you have to own the land. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, before the battle of Karbala, he knows that he's going to be slaughtered with his family. And he knows that he's going to be buried in this land. The Imam alayhi salam, what does he do? He ensures that he purchases this plot of land from its owners, so that when he dies, and look at the sacrifice. You would think that when you're going to give such a sacrifice, that some of these fiqh details, we can overlook it. We can make some concessions when it comes to the rights of people. But Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, he ensures that the place that he's buried is not ghasbi, that it's not usurped. In fact, there were some people who wanted to join Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And you know, sometimes when people would express their willingness to join him and their desire to be martyred with him, do you know what Imam al-Hussein would ask them? They want to give their lives for Allah and His Messenger and this religion. The Imam would ask, do you have any debts? And if the person said, yes, I have some outstanding debts, the Imam says, you're not allowed to be with me. Because you cannot say that I want to attain martyrdom if you're killed as a shaheed. The highest honor is to die as a martyr. Is there any more honorable way of leaving this world than to be killed in the way of God? That's the most honorable death. But the Imam says, you don't get to die an honorable death by neglecting the rights of others. Go, your taklif is to go and pay those debts. This aspect of our religion is lost, unfortunately. And I think the reason why a lot of people move away from religion, it's not because they're fed up with salah or they don't like to fast. It's because they had an interaction with someone who they thought was religious, but they did not understand the essence of religion. That how many people are not religious anymore because, I entered into a business relationship with so-and-so and I thought he was religious and he robbed me. We have all of these stories. And this shows us that when we trample the rights of others, sometimes it's not just their rights that we're taking away, we're pushing them away from religion itself. We have to be very careful. And I'm not saying that that is a justified reaction, but that's the reality. Religious hypocrisy pushes people away. And we have to understand that so much of our faith pertains to how we deal with the people in our lives. Now, we have so many ahadith that emphasize the importance of akhlaq. And what I'd like to do over the next 2 weeks is every night we'll speak about a specific relationship. And what is the guidance that Islam gives us with respect to that relationship? With our parents, our children, our neighbors, our siblings, and so on. And then inshallah, during the nights of Shahada, what I'd like to do is I want to examine Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib's relationship with God, with the Prophet, and with his wife, Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam. So all of Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. And then on Laylatul Qadr, the grand night of Qadr, we'll look at our relationship with the Quran, because that is also going to impact our relationship with those around us. We have a hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam where he says, "ما يوضع في ميزان امرئ يوم القيامة أفضل من حسن الخلق." On the day of judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to weigh our deeds, not on a physical scale. Mizan is basically a metaphor for how God is going to assess our deeds. The Prophet says the best deed, the deed that has the most value, because not all good deeds are the same. They all have value, but what will have the most value on the day of Qiyamah is husn al-khuluq, your akhlaq, your character. In another narration we have, in the month of Ramadan, we put a lot of effort into fasting. We sleep less in this month because we want to engage in Qiyamul Layl. And by the end of the month, we feel quite exhausted, right? Because we put in so much effort. The Prophet, he says, you can earn the thawab of all of these actions by doing something else. He says what? إِنَّ صَاحِبَ الْخُلُقِ الْحَسَنِ, the person who has good akhlaq, لَهُ مِثْلُ أَجْرِ الصَّائِمِ الْقَائِمِ. The Prophet says, if you have good akhlaq, if you have good moral character, he says you are rewarded the same reward as someone who fasts all day and worships all night. So when the month of Ramadan is finished, if you have good akhlaq with your wife, with your husband, with your relatives, with your in-laws, with your grandparents, with your children, you are constantly being rewarded for having good character. The reward that Allah gives to someone who fasts during the day and worships at night. In a narration that we have from Imam al-Sadiq salawatullahi alayhi, the Imam, he says, إِنَّ الْخُلُقَ الْحَسَنِ يَمِيثُ الْخَطِيئَ كَمَا تَمِيثُ الشَّمْسُ الْجَلِيدِ. People always ask, Sheikh, what can I do for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive me my sins? And what's frightening is that oftentimes we don't really remember all of the evil things that we've done in our lives. If you think about it, you might remember what you did earlier today, but do you remember the sin that you committed when you were 18 years old? When you were 20 years old? Do you remember all of the sins that you committed when you were young? We don't. Imam al-Sadiq, he says, there is a way for you to receive expiation for those sins. There's a way for you to wash away all of those sins. He says the person who has good character, good akhlaq, he says good akhlaq melts away sins in the same way that the sun melts away ice. If you have good akhlaq, having good akhlaq in and of itself will compensate for those sins and those misdeeds that you had in the past. Now, what should be the motivation for me to improve my akhlaq? The motivation is that you are the beneficiary. When you develop these virtues, you will live a more joyous life. In ahsantum, ahsantum li anfusikum. When you do good, you're doing good to your own soul. And we all understand this. We know, for example, that when I give in charity, when I help someone who is in need, the joy that I get, that I receive from giving is greater. It surpasses any pleasure that I receive from getting something. We understand that. And that joy that you feel in this life, that is just a small sample of what awaits you in the akhirah. It's like the immediate reward for doing good. But that's not the complete reward that awaits you. So when you do good, you're doing good for your own soul. So the irony is that if you actually want to serve yourself, you have to be less selfish. You have to be more giving. You have to sacrifice. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He tells us, I don't think there's any person in this world that doesn't want a peaceful life, a tranquil life. We all want tranquility, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us in Surah Al-Ma'idah, ayah 16, يَهْدِ بِهِ اللَّهُ مَنَ اتَّبَعَ رَضْوَانَهُ سُبُلَ السَّلَامِ. Allah says this Quran, it will guide you to the paths of peace. Subul is plural. The paths of peace. You want to have a peaceful, tranquil relationship with your spouse? Allah and His messenger, they'll show you how. If you want to have a peaceful, tranquil relationship with your siblings, with your children, with your neighbors, the paths of peace will be found in this sacred tradition. Now, I want to conclude with the following. It's very easy to talk about akhlaq. It's easy to write about it and to discuss it. But it's very different when you're in situations where your lower self wants to lash out and behave in an ugly manner. I'll give you an example. There was a great scholar by the name of Mullah Muhammad Mahdi al-Naraqi. He's the author of a book that many of you are familiar with, Jami' al-Sa'adat. How many of you have heard of a book called Jami' al-Sa'adat? It's a book on akhlaq, written by a scholar from Kashan 230 years ago. The book has been translated, and the book literally means the collection of felicities. Jami' means collection. Sa'adat is success. The collection of the things that will bring you success. It's a very elaborate work on Islamic ethics. Now again, it's easy to write a book about akhlaq, but it's very different to actually be a person of akhlaq. This scholar, he traveled to Najaf to visit the ulama in Najaf. So he was a very high-ranking, well-known scholar. So he arrives in Najaf, and the ulama of Najaf, they go and they visit him. And that's etiquette. When a visitor comes to your city, you go, especially a scholar, you go and visit them, you show them hospitality, and so on. There was one scholar who was the biggest scholar in Najaf at the time, one of the biggest. He didn't visit him. Sayyid Mahdi Bahr al-Ulum. He was the famous, well-known Sayyid who had certain encounters, according to some reports with Imam al-Mahdi, a very spiritual, learned person. So Mullah Mahdi al-Naraqi is thinking that, it's usually someone like him would come and visit. It's the etiquette that you would expect. So he swallows his pride and he says, okay, the Sayyid didn't visit me, I'll go and visit him. That took a little bit of humility. To swallow your ego and say, the norm, etiquette would dictate that he should come and visit me, but he didn't, so I'm going to go and visit him. He went to the house of the Sayyid, and the Sayyid used to have a room where he would receive guests, and other scholars were sitting. He came in and he said salam to the Sayyid, and the Sayyid just said alaykum as-salam and just basically ignored him. So that was insult number 2. I came to the city, you didn't visit me, I'm visiting you now, and you gave me the coldest salam and basically pretended that I wasn't there. He was just conversing with other scholars. He goes back. He's staying in Najaf for a short period. So he decides to visit the Sayyid again. Maybe he was busy, maybe he was having a bad day. He goes and he visits Sayyid Mahdi Bahr al-Ulum a second time. He goes, and again, very cold reception. He goes back. Mind you that he is at a celebrity status when it comes to ulama. He's expecting respect, hospitality. He doesn't get it. So he remains in Najaf for a few more days, and now he's about to go back home. So he's thinking, let me go see the Sayyid one more time. His companions say, Baba, you've humiliated yourself enough. You went the first time, he should have come to you. You went a second time, he ignored you. You're going to go a third time? He says, let me go a third time. He's a scholar, let me go and just farewell him. He says, I went to the house of Sayyid Mahdi Bahr al-Ulum, and I knocked on his door, and one of the servants, whoever was in the house, opened the door. Mullah Muhammad Mahdi al-Naraqi is at the door. The moment that Sayyid Mahdi Bahr al-Ulum heard that Mullah Muhammad Mahdi al-Naraqi is at the door, he rushes to the door barefoot without his cloak. He greeted him and showed him immense respect. Now, Mullah al-Naraqi is thinking, what's going on? Where was this warmth and respect the past 2 times that I saw you? Sayyid Mahdi was older than him. And he said to him that I read your book, Jami' al-Sa'adat, and I was impressed with the book. It was a good book. But I wanted to know if you are actually like what you write about. I wanted to see, you have a book on Akhlaq, but I wanted to test if you are a book of Akhlaq. And you proved that you are truly a humble servant of God. Anyone else would have lashed out. Anyone else would have allowed their ego to get the best of them. But you showed that you have truly absorbed the ulum of Ahlul Bayt. And you are more impressive than the book you wrote. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us and to guide us and to illuminate our hearts with the teachings of Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin.